you, Rob, for that great introduction. I have to say, after traveling around Toronto with Rob the last 2 days, he's an incredible, multi-dimensional guy. I didn't even know about the fish keeping, but just spending time with him, and he's not a bragger, he's very humble, but he's brave, intrepid, and very effective at what he does too with Zoocheck. So I wanted to thank him and Zoocheck for arranging for me to be here today. It is extra special for me to return to Toronto. I left here 30 years ago after living here 20 years, essentially growing up here. It has a great deal of meaning to me and nostalgia. And so I'm very pleased to be here. So thanks also to you for taking time out of your lives to hear me tonight. I spoke at a school earlier today in Thornhill, and sweet little kids, shorter attention spans, but I enjoyed it. I think it went well. We had fun, but I have to say it's more fun to speak to grown-ups because I get to use concepts like flatulent communication and sexual parasitism. So I will get to those, both of them. So I'm glad to be speaking to you tonight. Is this the remote I'm going to use? Oh, my favorite remote. Let's see how that goes. I'm going to start out with a personal story from when I was 8 years old. I climbed into an aluminum rowboat with the elderly director of a summer camp near Midland, about 100 miles north of here. And he rowed us about a quarter mile out into the lake, and we spent the next 2 hours fishing. I caught 16 fish that night. Most of them were small ones released back into the water, but several of them, the bigger ones, were kept for breakfast the next morning. Mr. Nelson did all the dirty work, riding earthworms on the hooks, pulling them out of the fish's faces, and plunging his knife into the skulls of the keepers before putting them into this basket on the side of the boat. I was a sensitive boy with a soft spot for animals, and a lot of what went on in that boat disturbed me deeply. But this kindly man at the front of the boat didn't seem to think there was anything wrong, so I rationalized that it was okay. I never took a shine to fishing. Once it came time for me to bait my own hooks and remove them from fish, I soon lost my enthusiasm. I just couldn't help seeing it from the fish's perspective. That was just about 50 years ago, and to this day we have a rather strange and stilted and limited view of fishes. We generally see them in either one of two contexts, as a source of food or a source of pleasure and recreation. So ingrained is fishing as a sort of sentimental and acceptable part of our culture that it's gratuitously used as a symbol of all that's good about life in North America. Tonight I want to encourage you towards a different view of this group of animals, to see them through a different lens, literally and metaphorically. I spent the last 4.5 years researching this group of vertebrates by swimming with them and also researching them and sitting at my computer, sometimes in really nice places like Puerto Rico, a balcony in Puerto Rico, writing about these creatures, which was at times challenging and stressful, but much of the time a great joy, because as Rob alluded to in the introduction, in recent years in particular, I would say probably because of technical advances, we're now able to explore the habitats of these creatures in a way that we couldn't before. And science, and I'm a scientist, so I delve into science, has been revealing some remarkable facets to these animals' lives that really undercuts the kind of prejudices and biases we've had against them in leading up to now. But so little of this science filters and percolates up to the public consciousness. So that was the major motivator for me to write What a Fish Knows, was to get this information, make it accessible to lay readers. So I'm going to go through a number of categories in my 4.5-hour lecture. Just checking you're listening. First thing I want to say about this group of animals is that they're remarkably diverse. We sometimes think we're living in an age of mammals. Perhaps that's because we're mammals ourselves. But in fact, the peak of mammalian diversity on Earth is past by a few million years. We are living in an age of fishes. Fishes, in particular the teleosts, the bony fishes, are the most diverse group of vertebrates by far. In fact, if you add up all of the other vertebrates, all the mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians, species by species. Collectively, there are fewer of them than there are fishes. Estimated 32,000 species at the top there. But actually there may be as many as 40,000 according to one ichthyologist I was speaking to the other day. And they, as you might expect from such diversity, they come in a huge range of shapes and sizes. This is a tiny little freshwater lake goby from the Philippines, of which, or whom, if you put 300 on one side of the scale and a Canadian penny, which I guess is no longer in circulation, so let's say an American penny on the other side, the penny would outweigh those 300 adult fishes, so they are incredibly tiny, and yet digestive, reproductive, excretory, nervous system all packed into that tiny little body. All the way up to an ocean sunfish who may live a century or more and may weigh 1.5 tons as an adult, and increases in size from the original egg by 60 million, which is the highest ratio known in all vertebrate animals. Not the biggest fish. The biggest fish is, of course, the whale shark, which you may know that. By the way, I just want to point out, also vis-a-vis the diversity of these creatures, sharks, rays, and skates, which belong to the chondrichthyan or the cartilaginous fishes, are in an utterly separate group from the teleosts, or the bony fishes. I point that out because really there's 6 major classes of vertebrates, not 5. We just collectively call them fishes because of the constraints of evolving in water. They're all kind of streamlined and they have fins and they swim around in the water, and so we just call them all fishes. But those 2 groups are at least as different from each other as our mammals are from birds. And also vis-a-vis the diversity, we have a huge array of often really beautiful creatures. I mean, this is the aptly named clown triggerfish. And I just want to gaze at that slide for a few hours, and maybe we should just do that. I mean, it's such a gorgeous creature, and we're not even seeing this creature swimming. And then you have fishes like flounders, flatfishes, who have to suffer the indignity of having one eye migrate from one side of the head to the other during their adolescence. Talk about an awkward adolescence. But a very useful adaptation to have 2 eyes on the side of the head when you lie on the substrate, with a fantastic ability to camouflage yourself against whatever that substrate is, looking out for predators and prey, and surprising them with an attack if it's the latter category. And then fishes like toadfishes, who don't really have fins. There's 40 odd species described of this group of fishes in the anglerfish family, and they really walk along the bottom with their feet and their hands, and they don't really fit the mold of a fish, nor do red-lipped batfishes or any number of other species who have evolved to sort of move calmly across the bottom, and they're stealth predators who sort of open their mouths and gulp in their prey in a surprise attack without having to be particularly fast, except for their incredible projectile mouth. And I don't think I have slides of some of the bizarre names of fishes, but there's the hairy-mouthed slackjaw, I think it's called. I find that a bit of an insulting name to be given that. On the other hand, the diagonal-banded sweetlips is a name I'd be quite happy to have. I will be showing you a picture of diagonal-banded sweetlips in a little bit, and I challenge anyone to not want to kiss them when they see them, because they are really, really kissable lips they have. Then we have the longest fish name, which is the Hawaiian Humuhumunukunuku Apua'a, which translates to the fish who sings like a pig and sews with a needle, I believe, something like that. And then the Nobel Prize for the crudest name of a fish or the inadvertently crudish name for a fish, everyone's waiting for this one, the slippery dick. Here we have a deep sea angler. This is going on YouTube. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe they can edit that little bit out. This is one of the deep sea angler fishes. There are an estimated 160 species that we are aware of. By the way, the deep sea abyss, which is beyond the penetration of light, and therefore permanently dark, is the biggest habitat by far on Earth. In fact, water habitats make up about 97% of the habitable volume of Earth. So that too partly explains why fishes are so incredibly diverse. But there are deep challenges to living in the depths. It's dark and it's cold around the clock, and yet many, many fishes have flourished there, some other species as well. But I did mention sexual parasitism earlier, and I want to show that here. I'm not quite sure how to use the laser pointer here, but you can clearly see there are 2 appendages on the bottom of this female anglerfish. And those are two males who have encountered her in the dark depths over the months or years preceding the time this photo was taken. And on encountering her, they bite onto her body, kind of willy-nilly. It doesn't really matter too much where. And that's it. They stay there for the rest of their adult lives. They become what biologists have called sexual parasites. I think that's a little bit anthropocentric. I think maybe the female anglerfish here, who has these two permanent suitors, might have a different opinion of that, given that her reproductive success is going to be compromised considerably if no male ever finds her and latches on. But they live there, and they become infused into her flesh, and they can inseminate her intravenously. So it is definitely a bizarre life history and a product of millions of years of evolving in a pretty challenging habitat where one member of your species might inhabit the volume of an entire football stadium. So if you find one, you better stick to her, literally as well as metaphorically. And then a bit of news that came out subsequent to my book. One of the hazards of writing a book or any kind of thing of that nature is that, well, a book is kind of, it's set, you know, you can't add new stuff. I mean, you can on your website, and by the way, I put out a monthly newsletter. If anyone's interested in getting that, email me at the address at the beginning. But there's always new news coming out about these creatures, and this is something that's not in my book because it was announced just about a month ago. The now new record for longevity of a vertebrate is held by the Greenland shark. These guys swim around very slowly in cold Arctic waters, and based on a recent analysis of corneal tissue from their eyes, these were about 30 specimens, individuals who were sadly caught inadvertently by fishermen, and the scientists analyzed their corneal tissue and found that some of them were approximately 400 years old. There was one who had about 392 layers of corneal tissue, and these are essentially like tree rings. They're laid down year by year. And so it's also been estimated that they may be, in some cases, they may be more than a century old before they reach sexual maturity. So, you know, we have some individual sharks probably swimming out there in the Arctic waters who were already a century old and still immature sexually when, you know, Benjamin Franklin was discovering electricity the hard way with a kite. What the fishes perceive, they probably invented all of the sort of senses that we're familiar with, vision and hearing and smell and touch and taste. They're also almost certainly the inventors of color vision. They have actually more color-sensitive cells in the kinds of color receptors in their eyes than we have. So they probably see the world more vividly and brilliantly, certainly underwater than we can. They also have some other really cool adaptations, such as a lateral line, which is a row, this is only on the bony fishes, a row of scales along the side that have depressions which cast a shadow, therefore this line looks dark. And that by looking closely at the tissues in these cells, there are little cup and gel-filled depressions within these depressions that have little hair-like things which are very sensitive to movement. So they detect pressure changes in the water, movements of the water, very handy during that half of the day when it's dark, at least half of the day, depending on how deep you live. And you can detect the presence of something that maybe you want to get away from or you don't want to bump into, for instance. And some fishes, like cave fishes, who've been living in caves for thousands of generations, have essentially lost their vision. They have all the genetic coding for eyes, and in fact, curiously, if you take young ones and put them in lighted conditions, they will develop normal eyes. But because it's costly to develop eyes, evolution has seen to it that they no longer develop eyes if they're living in the dark. But using their lateral line, they're able to orient and soon learn and navigate very effectively in the dark and know their habitats very well. Scientists have studied that. And then you have an example of a chondrichthyon here, a shark, in this case an aptly named leopard shark, who has electroreceptivity. Sharks can detect, they have all these little pores around their heads, the ampullae of Lorenzini, because that was the Italian scientist who discovered it a couple of centuries ago, that are very sensitive to electricity. Very unfortunate for some little, maybe a young flatfish or someone else who's hiding under the sand trying to hide, but their heartbeat gives them away because it puts out a little bit of an electrical pulse, and these guys are so acutely sensitive to that they can sometimes sense that and find their food that way. Very useful adaptation. I want to talk a little bit about a different kind of perceptivity of how the fishes may perceive what we regard as an optical illusion. This is the Ebbinghaus illusion. And those two orange dots are the same size, but they perceive the one on the right looks larger to us because of its arrangement with the gray circles on the outside. If you train fishes to basically cast a vote for one of two stimuli, one of two circles, and reward them for choosing the larger one, and then present them with this, they will choose the circle on the right. Of course, you randomize it and mix it up, and they'll choose it on the left if you reverse these figures. So they are essentially falling for the same kind of optical illusion as we do. Same applies to the Mueller-Lyer illusion, which is the two straight lines on the top, the one below looking longer because of the orientation of the arrowheads at the end, when in fact they are the same length. Red-tailed split fins here, another fish species tested with these illusions, will choose the lower when they're essentially asked, which is the longer of the two lines, they will choose the lower in this case. So they are falling for optical illusions as we do. One other similar example, the Canisa triangle here, which is this this appearance of a white triangle. There's no actual triangle in the figure, it's just implied by the other shapes around it. Bamboo sharks and other species will identify this as a triangle when they're presented with this. I think there's something poignant about that. It says that, to me, it says that a fish can have beliefs. They can believe that there's a triangle there, or they can believe that that dot is larger than the other one. The fallibility of them, which matches our fallibility in this case, says something about how they may perceive and view the world being a bit like how we do. Amba and damselfishes, one of many species of damselfishes, small and rather brave and pugnacious members of the reef, they look sort of yellow normally, but they actually, it turns out they have a covert communication system, individual recognition system, where they can recognize each other's faces in the ultraviolet light spectrum, which they're sensitive to. This allows them to identify each other by their face print, if you like. The one on the right is actually the same fish in this case as the one on the left, just photographed with UV light instead of the visible light that we're used to. Most fish species cannot see in the UV spectrum, it appears, which means that these guys can look conspicuous to each other without looking conspicuous and giving themselves away to predators. So it's a pretty handy covert face recognition system. Turns out fishes also can very easily learn to recognize human faces. And a recent study using archer fishes who have the advantage, this is the little slide on the right, that's a little picture of an archer fish who we'll meet again shortly in another context. They hunt by squirting water at targets like insects. That's very useful for studying their behavior because you can easily get them to vote unambiguously for one of two cues by squirting water at one of two little face pictures on the far right at the top, for example. And so you can test them to see, do you recognize that face that we presented with you with last week? And they show very clearly that they remember a face and they recognize our faces. So they're very visual in many cases, but also very perceptive, and they have good memories. So that's just a little bit about how fishes perceive. There's of course a huge lot more that could be said about that. What about cognition in fishes? How do they think? What do they think? Tool use until just a few decades ago was thought to be the sole province of humans. And now we know there are many examples of this, but many of us are not aware of tool use in fishes. They obviously have somewhat limited tools to work with, to wield tools themselves, because they don't have grasping hands, for instance. However, they do have a mouth, and they have a decent brain. And this blue fish on the right, this is a tusk fish, has just finished blowing water on the sand to uncover it. That by itself can be regarded as a form of tool use. You might expect that they blow water with their mouth. Some fish do that, but some actually, and you can watch a YouTube video of this, will turn away from the target and close their operculum. That's the gill cover right behind their face. They close it rapidly, and just like when you close a book, you snap a book closed. I probably don't actually need to do it. You create a puff of air. They create a puff of water that way, and that's a way also that you can blow sand off. And you can watch a YouTube video of a fish doing that, and it's pretty cool to watch. Anyway, after doing that, they do another kind of tool use. This fish has carried this unfortunate mollusk to a nearby rock, probably a specific and known rock, and uses it as an anvil. With a series of carefully timed head flicks and releases, this fish is able to crack open the mollusk to get at the soft tissue inside. And you can see there's other fish hanging around here, sort of bystanders. They're opportunistic, they know what's going on there, hoping to get a little piece of the action themselves. Here are the archer fishes I mentioned earlier from the human face recognition study. They also show what's called observational learning. They're very good observational learners. The two fishes on the left, the smaller ones, they may be young ones, let's just say they are, and they are probably watching this adult, this experienced marksman, to shoot a bolus of water at some target which is out of the picture. They are able to pick off moving insects by doing this. It turns out, careful study by, I think it was German research team, has shown that they use different techniques to do this. If the insect is flying by at a distance of more than about 7 or 8 inches, they use the sort of predictive tracking quarterback type technique where they aim and shoot ahead of the target. So the target's going here and they shoot this way, and the water meets the target, provided the target continues on the same trajectory. However, if the target is within about 7 inches of the water, they use a totally different technique. They rotate their body at the same rate that the target is moving by, and thereby they shoot right at the target, because the trajectory, I hope it makes sense, of the water is actually also on a path that will meet the target without having to shoot ahead. That's pretty sophisticated in itself. So two individuals, like these two smaller ones, if they've had no experience with shooting at targets, they can't even hit a target that's moving by 1/2 inch per second, very slow. It ought to be relatively easy. They need a lot of practice. What's curious is that they can learn to become quite proficient without ever doing it themselves by watching adults like this one here 1,000 times, then giving them their first shot at it themselves. They are far, far better at doing it than they were without that experience of observing the others. So that's called observational learning, and it's considered a pretty impressive cognitive skill for anyone to do. We look at animals like chimpanzees, our closest relatives, and it's much easier for us to appreciate their cognitive capacities. And yet, while just as chimpanzees can do some cognitive tasks that much better than we can, including remember a random array of numbers on a computer screen that are quickly replaced by white rectangles, uncanny ability to do that they have, far better than us, so too can fishes perform certain cognitive skills that are useful to them much better than we can, including this little one. This is a frillfin goby, a 4 or 5 inch long fish that lives in the same habitat as the slippery dick I mentioned earlier. And they live in intertidal zones, these rock pools when the tide goes out. And it's been observed over the years that these guys will leap from one rock pool to another. Say an octopus comes lurking through and they want to get out of there. And they're very accurate. They never end up stranded on the rocks. They always land in the neighboring pool. And the question is, how do they do that? How do they know which way to jump and to avoid making a leap of faith? Turns out they memorize these rock pool configurations at high tide. When the water comes in, they swim over, they look down, they make a mental map, that's the scientific jargon term for it, and they essentially memorize the topography, the orientation, the distances, the angles, through one trial learning. One high tide is all they need to do this. This was done in captive studies dating back as far as the late 1940s. And their success rate, accuracy rate, is just a little under 100% when they've had a high tide experience. Their success rate is about 15% when they're forced to jump without having had that high tide experience. So they have remarkable spatial memories, and they're learning on one orientation looking down, and then they're translating that to a horizontal orientation. It's pretty remarkable, and it's a beautiful example of how good a problem solver evolution is. Give her a challenge and a task, and if it's important enough to an organism, if it's useful enough to be able to do that, over the course of the luxury that evolution has is time. She has millions of years and hundreds of thousands of generations. She will come up with a way to do that. And that's a cognitive skill that this fish has that is quite remarkable and a product of evolution. Here's an illustration from a book just showing how they jump from one tide pool to another, and if they wish, they can work their way back out to the open ocean. So that's a bit about what a fish thinks, and that's, again, just scratching the surface or splashing the surface here. But there's only so much you can get into a 4-hour lecture. So I won't read this to you. You can all read. But this is the kind of jargon that one tries to avoid in a popular science book. Nevertheless, it's an important paper, an important statement, essentially translating to they have the basic raw materials to do what we can do and to experience what we experience, or in a comparable way. There's been scientific debate to this day about whether fishes feel pain. The consensus is well, there's really no real consensus, but certainly the majority opinion is swinging strongly in the fish's favor based on scientific evidence, such as that presented by Victoria Braithwaite in her 2010 book, Do Fish Feel Pain? The book is a question mark, but the answer is very clearly that they can, based on the studies of trout that she presents in there. They have the right kind of nociceptors, pain receiving tissues for different kinds of pain, such as mechanical pain, chemical pain, heat pain, and these signals are sent to the brain. The animals can move away, and they do, and they change their behavior, and they tend to remember the bad experience, and they avoid it in future. They're distracted by their pain, this sort of thing. There was a study done by another UK biologist named Lynn Snedden, which I think is not very fish friendly, but very, very clear illustration, I think, of these animals' capacity to do what we may expect intuitively that they can do, that is to experience pain and relieve it. She took about 30 zebrafishes, you can see why they're named that, and put them in a complex tank that had two chambers. One chamber was enriched chamber with rocks and vegetation and dim light, the kind of place they feel safe in and they can hide. And then that communicated with a second chamber that was barren. It was brightly lit with nowhere to hide. All of the 30 fish spent all of their time in the enriched chamber. Then they injected half of them with a saline solution, which presumably only caused a brief pain of the prick of the needle, and then half of them with an acid solution, which is caustic and probably hurt for a while. And then they watched the fishes, and they all remained in the enriched side of the chamber. They avoided the brightly lit until they dissolved a painkiller, lidocaine, in the unpreferred, avoided, brightly lit chamber, and after doing that, some of the fishes wandered across and started hanging out there, spending time there. And it was only the ones who'd been injected with acid, not the ones with saline. So the ones who were presumably in pain took steps to relieve their pain when they had the opportunity, even though it came at a cost. It meant swimming in an undesirable part of the tank. They were willing to do it because relief of pain. So a pretty, what scientists would call an elegant, and I'm sure some people would maybe call an unethical, but nevertheless an elegant illustration of something that's still being in debate by some scientists. By the way, I'm an associate editor of a new journal, an online open access journal called Animal Sentience. It's the first scholarly journal on animal feeling, and it's no subscription fees, so anyone can go anytime. One of the first articles submitted that we published was an article called Why Fish Don't Feel Pain. It's not a view we share, the editorial board, but this is scientific discourse, and we welcome different opinions, and if scientist wants to defend it. We also published commentaries, and we've had about 40 or 50 commentaries so far in response to that, mostly rebuttals. We may argue where to draw the line on sentience, who's sentience and who's not, who has feeling, who can feel pain and who cannot. When you get into the invertebrates and it gets a little bit gray areas, it's a little bit tricky. Wherever you draw the line, draw it with a pencil. And so says Tom Reagan, the philosopher, who's written a lot about this issue. And new scientific evidence is coming out all the time, suggesting that the line definitely encroaches majorly into the invertebrate groups. I believe that all the vertebrates clearly qualify as sentient, but also a growing number of invertebrates, the evidence is becoming strongly suggested that they too are sentient. And I think where there is doubt, we ought to give the benefit of the doubt to them. Another study that may be a little bit distasteful to some but is very revealing, involves striated surgeonfishes who were collected from the wild on the Great Barrier Reef, and they were individually subjected to a stressful situation. Each fish was kept for 30 minutes in a bucket of water that was just enough to cover their bodies, so they could breathe, but it was not a nice place for them to be. They don't know how long they're going to be there. And you measure the cortisol or stress hormone levels of them after that, and it's very high. It's elevated. They're stressed physiologically. And then they gave them the opportunity to swim in a tank, one at a time, where there was a model of a cleaner fish. I'm going to get to cleaner fishes shortly, but essentially a model that was either sweeping back and forth and could give them caresses, or stationary that couldn't give them caresses. And fishes who were put in a tank, who were stressed, put in a tank with a moving cleaner fish model, would swim up to it on average 15 times during the sessions that they were taped, and they would swim next to it and get stroked. They would receive caresses from this. And just as we get stress release by going to a massage therapist, their stress levels dropped significantly compared to those who were put in a tank where they only had this stationary cleaner fish model that wasn't moving. They ignored it. They didn't swim up next to it. So they're clearly aware of an opportunity to relieve stress, and they will take that opportunity when given the chance. A recent study from Norway where there's a lot of salmon farming. You may have heard of aquaculture, fish farming, factory farming of fishes has been the fastest growing sector of animal production for some time now. And this study reported on the frequency of what are loosely called dropout fish. That's the one below is an example of a dropout fish. They stop eating, they become stunted, they eventually float to the surface and they die. And their cortisol stress levels are very high as well. Probably just cannot cope with the stresses of permanent confinement, perhaps the boredom of just swimming in a circle, having aggressive bigger fish attack you and chase you away, maybe not getting enough food or not being able to compete. There's a lot of pesticides that are used in these because of the rampant parasites that can flourish in these intensive confinement situations. So there's a number of reasons why they may become, quote, severely depressed, which is the language that was used to describe the state of these fishes based on their stress levels. I can tell you that 20, 30 years ago, you would not see the phrase severely depressed being applied to fishes in peer-reviewed scientific literature. So that speaks to some progress, I would regard as progress, that we're seeing in how scientists view animals. Fishes respond in a way comparable to humans to anti-anxieties such as Valium and antidepressants such as Prozac. So what about fish society? Fishes have personalities. They are individuals. This is a Tasmanian blenny. I don't know this particular individual, but this may be a bold one or a shy one or easily aroused one. I mean, they have unique aspects of their lives. Here we are, diagonal banded sweet lips. Told you I would show them. I mean, I have to say, I want to kiss those lips. They're really, really sweet. Because whoever named them should get the Nobel Prize for fish naming. But we look at this cluster, this shoal, which is a small group of fishes swimming sort of willy-nilly, not necessarily migrating anywhere. We call it a shoal. A school is a more organized, orderly, and more determined group, usually a larger group of fishes. Just in case you were wondering, I didn't know that distinction when I started researching my book. But you look at them and they all look kind of the same to us, which is fine with me, but they are, of course, unique individuals, and they recognize each other. Every one of these ones in this show probably knows each one of those others as an individual. They may even have names for them that we haven't discovered yet. And that bears itself out in fish-human interactions. I mentioned face recognition earlier. Of course, if a fish lives with a human, then they're going to recognize them. And there's many, many anecdotes, including some that I include in the book, of fishes who respond specifically to an individual, probably because they've been feeding them, but also because they are a source of social stimulation. Little Mango, this pufferfish on the left, is about 8 years old here and spends his days alone. They typically are kept alone in aquariums, because they are predaceous and they will kill just about any other fish they're put with. Can't blame them, it's just their biology. And so he probably is a bit lonely. And when she came home from work every day, they would have these, she called them staring contests, but really, who knows, maybe it's kind of a love-in, a love fest. It's like, I'm so glad to see you. There's a reason we put the pufferfish on the cover of the book. They have the eyes oriented to the front. Just happens to be part of their biology, useful when you're a predator, but we relate to that more, and that's one of the disadvantages of fishes. They don't often trigger our empathy. They don't blink, or you don't need to blink when your eyes are permanently bathed in water. You don't need to cover them with eyelids and tears. They make a lot of sounds, an incredible number of sounds. A lot of them are named for the sounds they make, like grunts and toadfishes, etc. But we don't generally hear them because we're in the air and they're in the water. It's about as useful for them making their sounds in the air as it is for us to stick our head under the water and shout and scream for help. And then you have the social behavior of knife fishes. You can see why they're named knife fishes. They're shaped rather like knives. This is one of two major groups of fishes that not only are electroreceptive, like the sharks we saw earlier, but they actually communicate with electricity. They've evolved in murky water where vision isn't a very useful tool for communication, and they produce electric organ discharges, or EODs, on the left here. And they have a number of communication phenomena. They have sort of their own signature EOD, but if they happen to be EODing on the same frequency, both of them at about 400 hertz here, and they pass each other in the murky water, they might get a little confused as to who's who am I hearing here? And so the one on the right will lower his or her EOD down to 380 in this case, and the one on the left up to 420. That way they're more distinctive. They will also stop EODing if they're passing somebody who's a territory holder. So I think that might be the first example of described deference in a fish. Hands up if you've heard of flatulent communication, not including one I mentioned it earlier. Yes, indeed, herrings do engage in flatulent communication. They will, apparently in sort of a democratic process where they're trying to make a group decision about whether to move somewhere else because it's getting dark, it's time we went lower in the water column or what have you, they will release bubbles from their anuses and as a way of sort of essentially voting whether it's time to move. I have to say, if everyone was doing that, I'd be ready to move. I did a little cartoon to sort of lightly illustrate this phenomenon. Curiously, I showed this slide to the first group of students I spoke to today, and the teacher came up to me between the sessions and said, "Don't show that slide the second time." I thought, "Oh, really? It's just body function, you know." And then she said, because we can't really use the phrase speech impediment. It's a bit sensitive because some of our students actually are slow with language learning, and so I just completely didn't realize that was the sensitive issue. So I have to be careful about where I show this slide to. Another edit for YouTube, perhaps. Then we have cooperative vigilance. This was recently discovered and described in a published paper with regard to so-called rabbit fishes. I'm not quite sure what they're called rabbit fishes, but they're a group of reef dwellers, very pretty, usually with yellows and blacks. You can see there's 4 compartments here. These represent 4 different species of rabbit fish, and each photo has 2 of them. And one of them is invariably facing up, and the other one is facing down. The ones at the bottom are foraging in the reef. They're plucking away at bits of algae and whatever, coral and whatever they eat down there. Well, that's a bit of a vulnerable position because your head's down, you're buried in the substrate, and you cannot see if danger's approaching, some lurking moray eel or what have you. So they have a lookout. They work in pairs, and the fish looking up is the lookout. They're playing watch out for any danger, and if any danger comes along, they'll make a quick signal, and then both fish flee to cover. And then they switch off. After a couple of minutes, the one at the top goes down and gets to feed for a while, and the one who's been feeding looks out. So it's the scientific jargon that the scientists came up for this is cooperative vigilance. Perfectly apt term. It's also virtuous behavior because the one watching out is not feeding. They're giving up food for the time being. They're having to wait while somebody else has a piece of pizza. So it's an example of a growing domain of awareness that we have about animals that we might just call virtuous behavior, where individuals make self-sacrifices for the benefit of another, in this case temporarily, and there's a trade-off. It's a reciprocal altruism is another jargon term we can apply to it, because what's good for one is the favor is returned to another. From the hunting side of things, those hunting fishes who are looking for rabbit fishes who may not be paying attention, we have a remarkable discovery over the last few years that involves interspecies communication. This is just a still image and not a very high quality one, but you can watch YouTube videos of this as well. The large fish in the background is a grouper, and you may be able to see a moray eel pointing out of the reef, pointing to the left, just to the lower right of center. And the grouper is approaching this eel, probably knows this eel as an individual and knows this is where the eel hides out, and vice versa. And the grouper will swim over above the eel and make a head shake or a whole body shimmy, which apparently translates to, "Will you come hunting with me?" It's an invitation to join in a cooperative hunt. And if the eel is in the mood, they'll both swim off together over the reef, looking everything like a couple of Disney characters. And they will then proceed to chase fishes into the reef. The fishes usually hide in the reef, and the moray eel is sort of a ferret of the sea, can squeeze in there and go after that fish. And if the fish is caught, then obviously the moray eats, but if the fish escapes into open water, you know who's waiting in the open water, the big chubby grouper. And studies show with close measurements and observations by scientists with modern equipment who could spend a couple of hours with their scuba gear underwater that per capita food success and hunting success is higher when they work together. than if they work alone. So that helps to explain why this cooperative situation has evolved. It's also, to use another jargon term, referential signaling is involved here. That head shake or shimmy is an example of a signal to convey something that is distant in time and space, the actual hunting act itself. So it's referring to another activity, it's an invitation. Groupers will also swim upside down, pointing down to a place where a fish has fled in the ocean, in the reef, to signal to a nearby Moray, hey, there's something over here, come over. They'll wait as long as 23 minutes so far that's been observed in that position. And sometimes they'll just go over and try and literally almost physically drag the moray eel over to try and... Morays seem a bit slower than groupers, I think, in that regard. Courtship is something we see in the social behavior of fishes. A lot of them have quite elaborate courtships that may involve tactile communication, such as in these barred hamlets here. With I think it's the male swimming around the female in this case. By the way, it could be a male swimming around the female today, and tomorrow the sexes may be reversed. This is an example of quite a lot of fish species who can change sex very quickly, all without expensive surgery. And it's very handy in terms of the strategy of reproductive strategies that they have. And there's over 30, I think 32 describe sexual and mating systems. Sounds a bit redundant. Mating systems in fishes, which is more than all the other vertebrates combined as well. About 4 years ago, a Japanese diver and underwater photographer named Yoji Okata was diving off the southern coast of Japan, and he discovered this 6-foot wide mandala-like structure in the sand, about 80 feet down, and since that time more have been discovered. And he didn't know what it was, no one did. And he set up a camera and returned the next day and looked at the footage, and it turns out it was a little male pufferfish, about 4 inches long. It's a new species, previously unknown to science. I believe it's now called the white-spotted pufferfish. And he spends hours, if not days, swimming back and forth, fluttering his body and fins to make this marvelous structure, which, since it's the male, you probably guessed why he's doing it. It's an equivalent of a peacock's tail. I mean, it's something to display and attract and impress a female. And if she's dutifully impressed, then they will mate, and she'll lay her eggs there, and the eggs will be somewhat protected by these ridges in the middle. By the way, I can't point with this, I don't think. There it is. The male is right there, so that gives you an idea of scale. It's a lot of work, and it's a perfect circle, several concentric rings. Really exquisite. It's artwork. I mean, it makes me think that fishes not only can fall for optical illusions, but they also have an appreciation for aesthetic beauty. I certainly do. If I was a female, I'd go for it. Although I have to wonder if this is one of the mysteries of science. To me, that looks like a big badge that says, eggs here, come and get them. You'd think that would not be a very adaptive way of protecting your eggs, but apparently it works. It wouldn't evolve if it didn't work. Mouth brooding is a phenomenon, a very useful adaptation that's practiced by a few hundred species of cichlid fishes. And it involves usually the dad. Males do most of the caregiving, the parental care. Parental care exists in about 1/4 of all fish species, and it's usually males who do it. And it involves the male essentially calling in the young when there's danger, and then just opening his mouth and engulfing them into the mouth, where they know that's the place to go, and they hide out there, that little fry. And then when the coast is clear, he opens his mouth and spits them out again. And by measuring the size of the mouth, scientists have found actually that the males have a larger mouth cavity, so they're the big mouths of these species, and that's just simply because males through evolutionary time have been doing the child care. I've written a couple of books about pleasure. Rob alluded to that earlier, and why would we expect that fishes do not also experience this? And I've hinted at that a little bit earlier with the massage therapy that the stressed surgeon fishes went for. By the way, I forgot to mention, I was very pleased to read in that article that after stressing those poor surgeon fishes, the scientists returned them to their homes on the Great Barrier Reef. All of them survived the study, and I can tell you that's a rarity in published scientific literature, where scientists not only return them, but they also report it in the journal. And that's a bit of a growing trend that I'm beginning to see. We're very careful that if we publish any empirical studies in animal sentience, that we will require our authors to report on the disposition of the animals after the study, and we very much implore them to not harm the animals in those studies. We might not publish it otherwise. I think it's important that we work to get higher standards of ethics in the research where animals are used. Cleaner fishes, cleaner client mutualism. This is not only one of the most complex social arrangements in fishes, it's one of the most complex social arrangements in any group of animals. And I hope that's part of the message that's emerging, is that we don't need to be compromising the message for fishes. After studying and researching them for 4.5 years, I've become convinced that they deserve equal moral consideration to all the other vertebrate animals. And here we have two cleaner fishes working in tandem on, in this case, I believe it's a 5-banded angelfish. One of more than 100 described so-called client fishes. They don't call themselves that, we do, but they're called clients because they will literally wait their turn to be serviced by these cleaners who fuss over them, removing parasites, algae, undesirable things on their bodies. The clients completely cooperate with them because they love this spa treatment that they get. They let them swim in their mouths with impunity. It's never been observed for a client fish to eat the cleaner. It's simply not a good idea to consume your business partner. It doesn't tend to result in long-term business partnerships. And the cleaners swim in and out of the gills and they pluck over. And I do say fuss because they will take breaks from plucking off parasites and algae, and they will just swim over and flutter their pectoral fins to give a gratuitous massage, a little caress, extra caress. Why would they do that? Well, it is a social contract. These guys make their livelihood on this. They may service hundreds, if sometimes even over 1,000 clients in one day. They're very, very busy, and those parasites are food, and the algae is food, and so they get fed, and these guys get parasite removal service and spot treatment, and so no wonder they want to curry favor. But it gets Machiavellian. These guys, if there are lots of clients in the queue waiting their turn, they do a much better job than if there's one or two or no clients. You know, if you don't have any other customers watching, you don't have much to lose. So if you do a shoddy job, the costs are lower. For their part, clients are watching these interactions, and they actually form image scores. That's the term that the scientists use based on many observations, in particular in the Red Sea, of these interactions. They form image scores of cleaner quality. So if cleaners are doing a shoddy job, if they mucus nip, and I'll get back to that in a second, and the clients jolt, then that's a bit of a signal that their eBay ratings aren't very good, and we better go elsewhere. And so that's what I mean by Machiavellian. And they're also mimics who look just like these guys, but they're sawtooth blennies or some other species who will bite off a piece of fin when they get the right opportunity. That's pretty painful. Clients are not happy with that. So it is a complex relationship. There's over 150, 200 or so papers that have been studied, published on this so far. So really complex new discoveries and nuances of this relationship coming out all the time. And perhaps because there's now evidence that fishes enjoy being caressed, and fishes will caress each other, maybe we shouldn't be surprised that fishes like Larry here, who is a Bahamian grouper or a Nassau grouper, will swim up to trusted divers, such as this one in Florida. She sent me this photo. She's a journalist, and to be stroked. There's no parasite removal service going on here, but the fish knows that he'll get this nice, he or she will get this nice treatment, and so they'll do that. I spoke at Kansas State Veterinary School earlier this year, and after my talk, a student came up and said, "Oh yeah, my dad and I go diving in such and such a place every year, and we pet these groupers, these Nassau groupers who come up to us." So she said, "I'll send you some pictures." And she sent me these ones mugging for the camera. And here's her father with his regulator passing bubbles under the operculum, the gill cover for this probably ecstatic male. Or female, actually. I don't know the gender here, but this fish is probably enjoying the caress of these bubbles. I don't know if you ever do that. If you're ever swimming, push your foot down really fast and create bubbles and they come percolating up. You ever do that? Okay, I'm the weirdo. Some of you hedonists have done that. It just feels really nice. So that's what's going on here, I think. A very similar type of pleasure. Sharks, of which I'm happy to say there are more and more friends. I don't know about fewer enemies, but more and more friends among humans. There are people who specialize now in diving with sharks and trying to help them. such as Christina Zanotto here, who I interviewed for my book. She spends a lot of time. She wears a chainmail suit just for protection, because they do have sharp teeth. They seem to have no ill intention to harm her. These are gray reef sharks. They become very tame, and they're wild, but they know her and they trust her, and she will stroke them and essentially lull them into a complete relaxed state. Tonic immobility is the scientific jargon for this state. These sharks are hyper relaxed, and she's able to remove hooks from their mouths. Another photographer just sent me this. She said we see sharks all the time with very large fishing hooks embedded in their mouths. They've been cut loose maybe by the sport fishermen because they don't want to deal with them, and so they swim around for days, weeks, months, years with these painful hooks embedded in their faces. And they go down now, these divers, they go down with bolt cutters. In this case, you need a bolt cutter to cut this size of a hook. And she said, Teresa Guy said, we cut this one out, we got this one out of this blue shark, and this shark hung around and it kept swimming back to us. It looked like the same kind of gratitude you may have seen on YouTube videos of humpback whales and other whales that have been rescued from fishing nets. These are long-lived, quite big-brained animals. We've had a completely biased, wrong view about them. They are complex and intelligent creatures, and I do believe it's within their capacity to feel appreciation for, and to know that someone's actually helping them. And here's one of the gray reefs getting a kiss from Christina. I'm getting close to the end here. I did want to mention play. There is evidence now that's been published of play behavior in fishes. There's a number of criteria that biologists have for play behavior. Play is very important. It's sort of buoyant and seems a little frivolous, but it's actually important for developing physical strength, which is probably why young animals tend to play the most. Learning the correct social behavior, this sort of thing. And this study involves some male cichlids who started just spontaneously. It wasn't a study of play, it's just that this biologist noticed this behavior, that they were bumping around this bobbing semi-underwater thermometer in idiosyncratic ways. And it appeared to be play in the sense of maybe relieving boredom. They're a little bit bored in their tank, and so they would spend time interacting with this thing, which would sort of respond to being bumped, but it couldn't really attack them back, and maybe they kind of liked that. I want to wrap up just talking a little bit about the implications. This is the sobering part of the lecture, the implications of our troubled relationship with fishes. Given that, as I say, I'm convinced they have complex, rich lives, and they belong fully in the vertebrate camp. We tend to diminish them, oh, you're a vegetarian, but you eat fish, right? Or I've met many vegetarians or vegans who fishes was the last thing that came off their menu. That's often the case. Well, we just sort of tacitly hold them in a little bit lower esteem than the other vertebrates. And we do a pretty big disservice to them. The numbers of fishes it's usually measured in millions of tons, close to 100 million tons. It's kind of leveled off because we simply cannot remove more than we already have. We're sort of already stretching them beyond their limit, and you may have heard the phrase commercial extinction, where there may be some members of the species still left, but it's not worth, the profit margin is not worth the effort to catch them anymore because they've been so depleted. Estimates are that we catch and kill and remove from the oceans anywhere from a conservative estimate of 150 billion a year to a very high estimate of close to 2.9 trillion. If you line them up end to end, they reach the sun and back, if it's that kind of a number. It's easy to forget that they're all individuals. And it's a very wasteful and cruel methods of catching them. Nets are not very discriminating. This is actually a shrimp fishing net just hauled up off the coast of, I think, Mozambique, and you'll look pretty hard before you find a shrimp in there. There's a few shrimp in there, but mostly it's other species which are probably going to be discarded as bycatch, of which we produce about 200 million pounds a day that's cast back into the ocean dead or dying. And so it's a terribly rapacious and wasteful. The way the animals die is decompression, suffocation, crushing. Not exactly humane ways to die, nor is it for the tens of millions of sharks who are finned every year for shark fin soup. A little boy at the school asked me today, what does it taste like? I can't say from experience, but I've asked a colleague of mine who works in Humane Society International and is a Chinese national herself. She's eaten, when she was young, before she was enlightened, she ate shark fin soup and said it doesn't really have any taste. It's just more of a texture, which is very replaceable by plant-based products that can provide that texture. So there's actually no reason to be doing this. It was estimated in a recent study that we've removed about half of all the marine life from the oceans since 1970, and it was pointed out by the author George Monbiot in a recent book that by 1970 we'd already depleted a lot of the life from the oceans, so it's probably a lot more than half. We obviously can't continue having a relationship with the life in the oceans that we've had. There's a number of other ways we harm fishes, such as the aquarium trade. Rob alluded to that, I believe, a little earlier. He did, yes. These are Wangari cardinal fishes, very popular for the trade. They're beautiful creatures. They're caught in large numbers off of reefs, them and other kinds of fishes, often with destructive techniques such as cyanide poisoning and explosives, rotenone, this sort of thing. A lot of fishes die during collection, many more die during transit, and of those who survive, about 10% who survive to the tank stage. Often the people who have the tank don't have much of a clue of how to look after them and can't meet their needs. Hence campaigns like this to try to protect, in this case, the royal blue tang, the subject of Dory, the Finding Dory film. Don't find Dory is sort of the message. These fishes they swim in the wild. They're not captive reared or bred, not that necessarily makes it okay, but they live anywhere from 2 to 50 meters deep, and a captive aquarium is not going to be able to replicate that, never mind some of the other habitat, food, and social needs that these creatures have. There's a number of other problems that are facing oceans broadly, the habitats that fishes live in, including climate change resulting in warming of ocean waters. This applies also to freshwater habitats. Acidification, which is helping to lead to coral bleaching. Coral is losing its color and its integrity. And then microplastics, an insidious problem where tiny little balls of plastic, which are a product of plastic manufacture and the use of exfoliants and such, everything flows downstream, ends up in the oceans. A recent published study from a Swedish researcher showed photographs of larval fishes, little baby fishes whose stomachs had ruptured because they'd eaten microplastics thinking they were fish eggs, which is an important food source for these creatures. They can't tell them apart, and so it kills them. So it's another very serious problem. Then the macroplastics discarded and lost fishing gear, according to World Animal Protection, amounts to about 680,000 tons per year that's left in the ocean. And sadly, that gear continues to wreak havoc. Animals get tangled up in it, marine mammals, seals, whales, many fish, and eventually the weight of these dying creatures causes them to sink to the bottom. They play some role for scavengers, but it would be much better if all of that garbage was not there in the first place. We're dependent on the oceans, dependent on the waters. They make up about 3/4 of the surface of the earth, and unbeknownst to many, they are actually the leading producer of oxygen. Most of the oxygen that's available on earth is produced in the waters by blue-green algae. So where the oceans go, we go. We really have to be much more stewards than rapacious consumers of what's in the water. We are very adept at categorizing animals. The animal on the left is regarded as food in some parts of the world and a sacred beast to be protected in other parts. And the animal on the right, essentially biologically the same kind of creature, a mammal, is regarded as a beloved pet in most of the world, but it is a source of food in some other major parts of the world. So we're quite fickle in how we categorize animals differently. Fishes have further disadvantages, as I said earlier, not really triggering our sympathy. I think it's partly that they've literally and figuratively evolved below the surface of our realm for so long. It's only in recent decades that we've been able to start to appreciate the complexity of their lives. Given that they have such complex lives, I think it's incumbent upon us to usher in a new relationship. The time is now, not next year or next week. We need to start viewing animals as the American Jane Goodall of the oceans, Sylvia Earle, views them. Not as a source of food, but as a source of beauty and something to respect, someone to appreciate and protect. and have a better relationship as we go forward. And I hope you'll do all of the above. Thanks for listening to me tonight.